So welcome and good evening. My name is Samir Gandesha, and I'm the director of the Institute for the Humanities. I'm very pleased to welcome you to our book launch this evening. After I just say a few introductory words, I'm going to turn it over to my friend and partner in crime, co-editor, Peyman Vahabzadeh, who will say a few things, and then we will get started this evening. Before I go any further, I'd just like to acknowledge that the event is being hosted on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I myself am located on the territories of the Musqueam nation. We have quite a number of speakers, quite a number of contributors to our book with us today, and we'd like to hear from them, and also we'd like to hear from you, the audience. So I'm going to pass it over now to Peyman for a few introductory remarks, and then we'll hear from the various participants we have with us tonight. Peyman, over to you.
Thank you, Samir. My name is Peyman Vahabzadeh. I speak from University of Victoria, where the university rests on the territories of Lekwungen-speaking people, the Sankees, the Esquimalt, the Wasanich people, on whose unceded territory the university stays and we live. And with that acknowledgement, I would also like to thank you all for being here and joining us in this celebration of Ian's work, but also the book launch for the book that is basically a celebration of Ian's work and legacy, intellectual legacy, I should say. So with that, I give it back to you, Samir, and then we can go through the speakers, and then at the end, I'll come back with some remarks of my own about the book and the experience and so on. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Peyman. I'd like to now call on Ian Wallace to speak.
Thank you, Samir and Peyman. It's a real pleasure to be invited to say a few words on this particular occasion. Now, I'm not a professional philosopher like you are, so I'm going to keep my comments brief, as Samir asked us to do. I speak as an interested outsider, as I think of myself, as an engaged member of the general public, and who has attended a number of these valuable and stimulating public events hosted by the Institute of Humanities at Simon Fraser University. Above all else, really, my participation is inspired by the fact that I support and recognize the importance of the role of the academic community of the university, and not just Simon Fraser, but all universities and all academics, to offer a rigorous level of discourse about the significant issues of the day. And I celebrate the efforts of the Institute of Humanities at Simon Fraser University to go beyond the ivory tower of intellectual exclusivity and to make this discourse available to the public at large. Each contribution for this collection of essays speaks border crossings, speaks to the significant issues of the day, and attempts to name those forces that affect our society and to locate a position from which the values and insights of each of these writers can provide a basis for action. However, it should be acknowledged, from my point of view anyways, that the terminology and references in some of these essays will be a challenge to the non-specialist reader. But that said, these essays rigorously attempt to theorize and formulate a language that will effectively critique those ideologies that dominate the public discourse that affects all sectors of our society, and to uncover the intellectual frameworks that can legitimate a healthy and progressive society. The attitudes and actions that we employ in our everyday lives are influenced by unconscious forces that permeate our society. These forces must be identified so that we can act with clarity of purpose and a clear conscience. I was especially impressed by the final chapter of Border Crossings. The moving and eloquent contribution of Ian Angus himself in a statement to the court during the sentencing for his participation in the protest blockade of the Kinder Morgan pipeline. One sentence in his statement clearly resonates with me, and that is, quote, "The critical intelligence of citizens is essential to a non-repressive social order, unquote. In this statement, Ian Angus has crossed from being an engaged academic to an activist citizen. It is a fitting coda for a book titled Crossing Borders. There's no easy answers and contradictions remain, but I commend all of the contributing writers for their efforts. And I recommend this book to all that they may join the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ian. I just want to show you, I don't know how well you can see that, but this is the cover of the book. And it is a cover based on a painting of Ian's, Ian Wallace's, which is entitled Abstract Painting, Blue on White from 2011. And we are absolutely so honored to have this as a cover of the book. So thank you so much for your contribution, Ian. Thank you for your remarks. We really appreciate it. Now I'd like to call in Jerry Zazov, a longtime friend, colleague, and comrade of Ian's, but of Peyman's and myself as well. Jerry.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me all right?
Yes, go ahead.
I'm seeing faces I haven't seen for a very long time. Johannes, hello. And Len, I haven't seen you in a very long time either. And even though I have seen Ian in my imagination, that's the first time I've seen Ian for a while too, and Peyman as well. Ian and I met in Casablanca in an elevator many years ago. It was quite a happenstance meeting. And he asked me what I was doing. He knows my story. And I asked him what he was doing. And that was the beginning of a friendship, although I had known of Ian before. Let me just say a few words, Samir and Peyman. I'm in awe of the book, and it's not been possible for me to read all the essays yet. I see Dan Aylman's picture's photo's not on here. Is that? Oh, there he is. I just really want to say a few words about what I wrote for Ian. It was an attempt to create a number of conversations in a Bakhtinian dialogical mode. I wanted to keep several conversations going on at the same time. And this was, in a way, related, which I didn't have a chance to say it directly in the essay because Peyman and Samir kept cutting down what was the words. But there was this fellow here, Dostoevsky, who wrote a book called The Possessed, right? And Ian and I talked about The Possessed at one. Can you see that? Can you see him?
Yep.
Yeah. And that book is a classic example of the endlessness of conversation, which is aesthetically characteristic of the novel, in my view. It's the endlessness of conversation that is only interrupted by other conversations. And I felt in this conversation that I have had with Ian for so many years, that the dialogism in the conversation kept bringing up new and different material. And I wanted to try to capture that idea of the endlessness of inner speech. Whether I did or not is another question, of course. But in recognition not only of my own crossing of borders and Ian's crossing of borders and Samir's crossing of borders and Peyman's crossing of borders, I decided to talk about Siegfried Kracauer's exterritoriality. Kracauer, I have been working on his film work, on his ideas for many, many years. And I read in the process hundreds of letters written by Kracauer before he left Europe and on his way from Berlin to Paris in his exile. So it seemed to me that I could write something for Ian and in a way about Ian and about my relationship to the exilic paradigm by referring to the idea of exterritorial exile. As Krakauer put it many times, the exile experiences that which has fallen apart, and we always have to put it back together again. And that, I think, marks my own aesthetic. But at the same time, there's a degree of challenge in my essay, which I think Peyman and Samir might have gotten because they kept telling me to shorten it. That is a bit of this fellow here. Do you recognize who that is? That's the Schweik character. And this is a Russian doll of the Schweik character, that if you open up the doll, you keep getting more and more smaller and smaller dolls. But nevertheless, what I hope to create in the essay, Samir and Peyman and the others, is a sense, as I say, of the vulnerability of conversation that we have in our life and that I've had with Ian and Peyman and Samir as well for a long, long time. And in that regard, I wanted to create a sense that dialogism is inherent in Ian Angus's work, and that is what I responded to.
Thank you, Jerry. Thanks very much. Let's now turn to Dan Aylman.
Can you hear me okay? Okay, testing 1, 2, 3. Yeah, we're good. Okay. I'll try to be epigrammatic. I'm Dan Aylman. I'm an assistant professor of writing and rhetoric at the University of Toronto, where I teach writing for social change, digital rhetoric, and a brief history of persuasion. I was honored by Samir's invitation to participate in this collection. The invitation emerged out of a conversation we had a few years back in Toronto about interdisciplinarity and activism, two words that are encountered a lot in the liberal humanities and social sciences, but usually in disappointing, poorly thought through formulations that sadly tend to have more to do with prestige than concern. I told Samir that I was especially interested in Ian's heteroglot polymath approach to scholarship and the extent to which this experiential life world, his attitude towards ideas and the academy in particular, is consubstantial with his approach to activism, some of which Ian Wallace glossed, so I won't recapitulate what he said. I was, and still am, fascinated by Ian's interrogation of the relationship between the all too often sequestered domains like communication, technology, nature, culture, and yes, academia and activism. So my chapter uses his work and activism as a sort of leaping off point to reflect on pervasive attitudes about an interdisciplinary configuration defined by rhetoric or symbolic environments, ecology, i.e. natural environments, and media, technological environments. Oh, can you hear me okay? Was there a problem? No, I heard something. Okay. According to my admittedly idiosyncratic reading, for Ian, conventional ideological barriers between disciplines like philosophy and rhetoric, or communication and media studies, fall apart in two kind of paradigmatic ways that I explore in my chapter. One is their internal inconsistency. When probed according to their own logics, siloed in disciplines tend to collapse in on themselves. Picking up on this thread in his work, I tried to bring Ian's ideas into resonance with the work of interdisciplinary, rhetorically minded thinkers like Kenneth Burke, Marshall McLuhan, and Peter Sloterdijk, all of whom arrive at coextensive conclusions to Ian's own. Another antagonist of overly rigid institutional silos is the real of nature itself, as evinced by our current pandemic crisis. An unassailable truth that, as Ian observes, indigenous thought tends to appreciate better than claspirational semioticians in corporate branded ivory towers. But that's not to say that Ian's work is hostile to the university. To the contrary, he resurrects an almost Kantian understanding of the potentials of the academy with a view to making the figures of the public intellectual and the educated citizen compatible with the political complexion of the digital 21st century. And I contend this may be his greatest contribution at the end of the day. And that's all I have to say. So thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, Dan.
You're welcome.
Let's go to Lenore Langsdorff. Welcome, Lenore.
Yeah, unmute myself. Thank you for the welcome. It's a pleasure to be here. Thinking back to when Ian and I first had a long conversation about the topics that have just been mentioned, the similarities perhaps, but the divergencies between philosophy, the field in which I was educated, and communication, the field in which I, in large part due to Ian's encouragement, spent 20 very profitable years teaching the philosophy of communication and rhetoric. I had always been taught as a philosophy student that rhetoric and philosophy not only had nothing to do with one another, but were born enemies. And it was only back in 1984 when Ian and I both had the great pleasure of being at a conference at the University of Toronto and taking a long walk one afternoon after the conference was over. And I mentioned that my interest in the philosophy of communication had been growing steadily, in part largely Kenneth Burke. And I was brave enough, I guess, in my summary of my activities that the Department of Philosophy required that I produce each year, to list the philosophy of communication as one of my areas of interest and beginning to be research. I handed that into our chair of the department and was rather taken aback when it appeared back in my mailbox a day or two later with the word communication struck out and language put in. Philosophy of language was an acceptable pastime for analytic philosophers in particular, but philosophy of communication was an absolutely unknown idea. My beginnings in the field certainly then go back to that long conversation with Ian when he also opined that perhaps I was really a rhetorician. And that was even more shocking because, again, going back all the way to Plato, philosophers and rhetoricians have nothing to do with one another. One speaks truth and the other one just speaks. But I can't remember now who it was that mentioned at one point that I've just lost the picture. There it is. That about anybody could pretend to be a philosopher, but it's a good philosopher even, but it's very difficult to pretend to be a speaker. Perhaps that was Ian himself. Can't remember. Over the years, it has been an enormous pleasure to discover that I am not alone in blending these two notions and putting them together with social and political issues. Ian is the leader in this. The book certainly shows it in the essays, all of which have been a total delight to read, to contemplate, and perhaps most of all, the picture of Ian and Viviana at the protest against the pipeline. It's a protest that's ongoing here now. Also, the notion that we live on land that has never been ceded to us. I write from Texas. And this was a land in which the Apache and the Comanche and the Cherokee peoples lived. It's not clear to me which territory in particular that would have been claimed most. I guess that I expect that had changed in the course of various antagonisms. But after that, of course, Spain came to North America and claimed a goodly part of North and Central, what we now call North and Central America. And then given the war from that enabled Mexico to secede from Spain, this land that I am now on was Spanish territory, a Spanish land, until the US forces came marching in to take it over. So this is the land on which we sit now, that has been claimed by many people, from the original indigenous folks to succeeding waves of conquerors. Perhaps that's over by now. There's still a great move in Texas to, or at least a minority move, to secede from the Union and therefore avoid all sorts of regulation and taxation and all that kind of thing. But unless that comes to be, then we will remain a country that has taken over areas that were successively colonized by the British, the French, and the Spanish. I think that's all I'll start with right now, and perhaps I can say more later. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lenore. Let's now move to Johannes Merrick has been very patiently with us in the Zoom room, although it is in fact, I think, about nearly 3 a.m. in the morning in Vienna. So Johannes, before you keel over, let's hear from you, please.
Yes, thank you. Hello, Samir. Hello, Ian. Hello, Jerry. I know you nearly for 20 years. I came first time to Canada in 2004, and the reason was a book written by Ian, Border Within, and it was a so strange experience for me, that book, because I was at that time based in Mexico, and the first time I read an English-speaking philosophy book in which an author from Latin America is quoted not by a Latin American specialist, but by a philosopher. So actually, a philosopher takes seriously what is going on philosophically in Latin America, and this philosopher is not a specialist on Latin America. This means this is a philosopher in his own rights, and nobody cares in this moment if he is really from Mexico or not. That was really impressive for me, striking. I never have seen these in my years when I was studying philosophy in Austria, because obviously philosophy outside Western Europe and North America, well, these philosophers, well, they're not really thinkers, they only be thinkers, or you have the specialists, the area specialists for them, but that's not something serious what they're doing here for us, for the real philosophers. That was the reason why I tried to get in touch with Ian, which was quite easy. I sent him at that time an email, and at that time, before neoliberalism came to Canada, you had a wonderful research program called Faculty Research Program, and so I could come to Vancouver with public money from the Canadian government, and that was the beginning of a long-term friendship. For me, maybe the most important element I learned at my stay at Simon Fraser University was the similarities. We discussed between what Ian and others have called first world dependency towards the United States, in the case of Canada, which obviously was something that for me was very familiar from the Latin American point of view. So I really started to engage with a comparative perspective. And that is also the text, that's my text in this book, where I try to find some similarities between two outstanding philosophers of the Mexican side, Leopoldo Sea. By the way, that was the author Ian has reflected on and engaged on. It was about identity issues in Canada and also identity issues in Latin America, and George Grant, whom at that time I started to engage very profoundly with the help of Ian, and he was, as you can all imagine, super generous, receiving me at the airport personally. I never will forget that. And also afterwards connecting me with colleagues at Simon Fraser University and beyond, among others, Arthur Crocker, who I think had also a quite important contribution, intellectual contribution in my article regarding technology. So I use this small moment also once again to express my gratitude to Ian to open me this window. And once again, also thank you for old friends I'm seeing here in front of me. Thank you.
Thank you, Johannes. Really great to see you again, and hopefully we'll meet in person sometime in the not too distant future. Yeah, good. I'd like to now call on Hilda Fernandez.
Hello. Thank you, everyone. I'm very glad to join the celebration of Ian's thought. I met Ian in a social event with Viviana at the house of an Argentina friend, Mariana. Mm-hmm. And from there, a solid friendship among our families has kind of emerged, and a very auspicious connection between the Institute for the Humanities and the Lacan Salon also emerged. And for me, Ian's thought has been kind of a point of reference when I am thinking about Marxism, institutions, and the sociality in general. So my contribution to Crossing Borders, a fetch script for Ian Angus, is titled Psychoanalysis, Critiques and Possibilities Then and Now. And it was a paper I read at the conference Then and Now, 1968-2018, organized by Ian, who invited me to put together a panel to discuss resistance against dominant psychiatric and therapeutic paradigms. And I was accompanied by social worker Dedra Evans and Mad Movement activist Richard Ingram. So my field is psychoanalysis. That's why I was invited to do this. So my chapter in this book first contrasts two sets of discourses. The first set contrasts Laborde Clinic back in 1968, and 50 years later, the Global Mental Health Institution of 2018. As we know, in 1968, the revolutionary spirit seized the public will, and it was the climax of an antinomian agitation that targeted French institutions and extended later to the rest of the world. Laborde Clinic, it was a psychiatric institution in Cour-Cheverny, France, which incorporated a Marxist psychoanalytic approach influenced by the work of Jacques Lacan. And it was a quasi-utopian mental health clinic that was also a center for emancipation and liberation. This clinic was led by Jean Horry and Félix Guattari, who had kind of some training, Jean Horry with Frantz Fanon, this greatest anti-colonial psychiatrist. So in this clinic, there was an egalitarian spirit. The psychiatrists cleaned the kitchen, the cooks administered medication, poets named the rooms, and their meetings had no agenda but a imperative that was modulated by local law, which is characterized as a as in attempt to reach the non-totalized totality of the institutional field. But then fast forward 50 years and we are facing the global mental institution as a system that tends to exclude desire and injuncts obedience as a consequence of the transformation being determined by the socioeconomic model that relies in the replication of neoliberal interest in the form of homogenization of modalities of psychotherapeutic treatment and a measurement of well-being according to hegemonic modes of relationship. That was the first set of comparison, Laborde and the mental health institution of now. The second contrasting discourse refers to Laborde and the Anti-Oedipus, which was written by Guattari and Deleuze in 1977. Anti-Oedipus is a wonderful proliferation of critical thought that liberates desire machines, boisterously sharp, humorously poetic, plays with language, warms hearts, and sets its gaze on the modes of gaining power, rebelling against the rules of the always coagulated exchange of the institution. Both interventions, Anti-Oedipus and Laborde, are needed at any political juncture. The embodied praxis, the mise en scène of Laborde, is the first step of an imminent critique that Anti-Oedipus will theoretically unleash few years later. My point here is that Laborde demonstrates criticism in action that confronts idealism directly. For example, it was possibly very difficult to ignore manifestations of conflict, dissatisfaction, etc., while interacting among humans in such practice. These pragmatic difficulties don't happen when you are writing a book. And then I believe that the immense energies that are saturating symbolic and cultural productions, the book, the article, the journal, the artifact, should be balanced with a viable praxis grounded in intellectual and ethical thought, which, as Ian Wallace mentioned, Ian embodied in the coda of this book. By comparing these two sets, I aim to conclude that institutional critique should be a practice whose ethical endeavor is the promotion of political agency and democratic values more urgently in the dire times we live today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hilda. Let's now turn to Kevin DeLuca. Kevin, welcome.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. It was quite an honor to participate in the book project, and it's quite an honor to be here. And it's also nice to put a lot of faces to their essays. So I appreciate all of that. And I'm, speaking from the Evil Empire. And I first met Ian when he was in exile in the United States. And I didn't realize he was in exile at the time, the original meeting. It took me a while to figure that out. But some of the book titles that he wrote would clue me in eventually. And it was a very fortuitous meeting for myself in the sense of it was my very first semester in graduate school at the University of Massachusetts. And it was an MA program. And Stuart Hall was actually visiting for those 2 opening weeks. And you think that might be the most momentous part of my first semester, but it was actually meeting Ian and being in class with him. And I really feel that for myself, and Ian may, shy away from taking any credit for this, anything good in my thinking came from my MA program with Ian. It was that important. And I used to feel, well, people need to go to graduate school to learn to think. But actually, I've narrowed it a lot. People need to work with Ian to learn to think. And so it's a very specific and lucky chance for myself. And in that opening semester, Ian arranged for me to type out Stuart Hall's lectures, like the transcription with a little transcription machine. And luckily, I had 2 fingers that could type. So, sadly, only 2. And it was a long and laborious process for myself. But Ian thought I did such a good job that he later had me type out the transcripts of a class that he gave that later became, I think, to a large extent, primal scenes of communication. And so I got to, overuse those two fingers again. But the experience was so fundamental to have the chance to spend so much time, especially given how bad a typist I was, with Ian's thought and because I'd have to stop that machine like every 5 seconds and go back. There's this little machine. And speaking of technology and Ian's work. Okay, so to me, those experiences kind of laid that foundation. I talk to graduate students all the time about that now, that foundation early on carries through and stays with you, even when you're not necessarily citing people or making a show of it. It's always there. And Ian's role, I was thinking about this later, was really helpful in terms of kind of his perspective as an outsider, both, not, an insider to the United States, but also not an insider to the discipline of communication. And it ended up being really fundamental in 5 ways. First, I'll read this quote that I open my essay with, but just by Ian, that shows this fundamentalness. The thesis proper to communication studies in the context of the philosophy of the human sciences is the constitution of perception, social relations, institutions, and thought by media of communication. Now, oddly enough, almost all communication and media scholars in the United States completely ignore this important role of media and form in the constitution of the world, which Ian's work highlights over and over and over again in very significant and profound ways. And so I think Ian opened up that for some of us, right, to think through communication studies, not about content, but about form, and to focus on that. The other things that Ian introduced for us, or introduced his angle, was a particular emphasis on social movements, and especially environmental social movements, coming from the Frankfurt School and then Lease and the Domination of Nature, as well as Ian's own work on that. So these were, especially Lease, not as widely read in the United States. And then I would say one last thing about these introductions, and I'm pretty sure Ian is really responsible for this, which is at the time he was reading and teaching Leclerc's Hegemony and Socialist Strategy. And I don't think anyone else in communication was doing that at all. Ian wrote an important essay on that. I also followed up with some of my work on Leclerc and Mouffe. And then it became pretty widespread. At one point, Leclerc was speaking to comm departments a lot and being a visiting scholar at Northwest. Okay, I want to highlight kind of the last thing that I think Ian gives us in this focus on media and translation or mediation. And the last point, I think, is just that I get from Ian's work is that we cannot escape mediation and translations. Like, that's our lot, to always be amidst all these endless translations. And on my bad days, it's a little depressing. Where is the purity of nature and so on. But on my good days, it's where are the possibilities and joys in these mediations and translations. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kevin. Really appreciate it. Now, let's turn to Len Finley. Len, welcome.
Self-muting is one thing, being muted is quite another, and we could talk a lot about that. So I'm in Saskatoon, in Saskatchewan, in the middle of the Canadian prairies, on Territory 6 and the homeland, traditional homeland of the Métis. And these are important acknowledgements that have become increasingly important in recent years as Canada, or at least some of the institutions and localities in Canada, are trying to decolonize themselves in the interests of reinflecting and redirecting the national project. when I came to Canada, I recognized pretty quickly that in order to become a Canadian, I had to involve myself informally and then much more concertedly in what one might call Canadian studies. And that was my first encounter, one of many. Ian and I don't meet very often, but a rich river of sedition runs through our conversations and our cabals, and I hope, our mutually enriching friendship. So the idea of contributing to this book was immensely attractive, but also quite nerve-wracking for me, because Ian's work, like Ian, is generous and tough in roughly equal measure, and in the very best sense of both of those terms. And so my chapter in the book, dealing with the feral and the federal, is kind of typical of me playing off terms that are contiguous, terms like space and place, that are often conflated but need to be very bad neighbors with each other in order to be productively contiguous, I think. When the book eventually arrived, after all my wrestling and anxiety and the quiet tyranny of its two editors, Samir and Peyman, when it arrived, the first thing that struck me was that this was a beautiful book. And I have to give a shout out first to Ian Wallace for the image that graces the front cover, because the image captures, even in its apparent lack, its heroic non-referentiality is actually a profound reference to what Kevin mentioned on the importance of form in our understanding of communication and the politics of form. So Ian Wallace's image is redolent of disciplinarity, but it incorporates within itself, in its multiple borders within, all the possibilities of eruption, disruption, within a broad context of disciplinarity that helps to keep the project we know as the modern university alive. That's not the only beauty in this book. There is the beauty of inflections in the book, inflections of ideas fairly familiar or less familiar. There is the beauty of infractions in the book in which people cross borders. There's a form of, I think, entirely appropriate trespassing going on in the book, border crossing, and negotiating various forms of liminality in ways that bring out productive versions of difference and the possibilities both of community and rapprochement across difference. And there is the beauty of friendship, celebrated, lasting friendships. As one gets older in life, the mere phenomenon of duration causes one increasing wonder. And the idea of durable friendships, the ones that are boisterous, raucous, that perform real differences from time to time, in the inevitable amnesias, as the world claims us in the ways it does, some welcome and some not. So the beauty, so I tried to make my chapter absolutely and unapologetically dialectic, because saving the dialectic is one version, I think, of the work that many of us have undertaken and tried to keep going. And so the notion of the wild and the notion of the state. And when I first began trying to become in some way, after my modest fashion, a Canadianist, I was assured by people in Canadian studies that I shouldn't bother. That Canadian studies, like Canada itself, was dull and dubiously virtuous. So I should stick to what I'd come to Canada with as a Victorianist and someone interested in material culture in Europe in the 19th century and its co-presence and co-production with radical culture. But Ian, reading Ian, persuaded me of the fatuity of that particular self-deprecation, or maybe even self-denigration, that Canadian studies were dull and dubiously virtuous. I don't think they're virtuous at all. I think that the problematic of virtue is very much in play in Canadian studies, largely, I think, because of the kinds of revisionary work, the kinds of patient, implacable curiosity that Ian and rigor that Ian has brought to bear on signifiers like English Canada, and that promoted so much steady thinking in me as I went from various kinds of activity, like Ian, running a humanities research center, trying to recover the humanities as a radical intellectual formation within an increasingly corporatized university, using the humanities, believing in the project of the university in the current conjuncture, not backing away from the difficult, not disguising. Kevin, I think, was talking about good days and bad days. And we were all nodding either openly or inwardly, because there is melancholy on the margin as well as resolve. And some days it is very difficult to get out of bed and to think of oneself as a productive agent in a world that seems so catastrophically obtuse and ruinously self-absorbed. That's just scratching the surface of my dystopian melancholy, but I'll leave it at that. So my conversations with Ian have gone on intermittently, always productively. And I knew that if I saved my sweetly sentimental tone for the end of my piece and a kind of heartfelt tribute in my coda to my essay, but I thought I had to work him over, slap him around a bit, and what preceded that, otherwise he would never speak to me again. So we had a little bout of difference, but all within the framework of admiration and celebration for the extraordinary diversity and the amazingly uniform quality of his work and the unforgiving nature of his engagement. I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, Len. I'd like now to call on Stephen Collis. I think you have a poem for us, Stephen, or are you just going to make some remarks?
Yeah, well, let me just begin by saying how happy I am to be here and pleased to be participating in this. I can't remember exactly when I met Ian. I wish I could say it was in an elevator in Casablanca. That just sounds marvelous. But what I do know is that I've been working fairly closely with Ian since probably around 2010 in the Goldcorp fiasco, essentially as organizers, largely through the Institute of Humanities, but it feels very much like relationships I have with organizers in different communities. That is that Ian and I and other people, Samir too, we get down to work together. And it's sometimes fraught, sometimes difficult, sometimes challenging, but always really meaningful work. And Ian has always been a model for me of intellectual rigor, of moral clarity, and of committed social thought and being. And all the work I've done with Ian has been very meaningful for being able to learn from his example. So I'm just going to read a poem. My contribution is not an essay. It's a poem. So now for something completely different, I'm just going to read part of this poem. It's called a sketch of a poem for Ian Angus. It's not a matter of what we think so much as it's what thinks us. Great blue heron, monkey tree, coastal junk and westerly wind. Slide of the author in a forest on the screen. Who sees all beings in her own self, and herself in all beings loses fear. No arrows are seen in time's flight, but birds fall to the earth just the same. Years ago, I read Neruda's memoirs on a fishing boat at dusk by the pier, simply wanting to make the invisible visible. Structures, ideologies, drives and drivers. Desire to tenderly map all our failures, for which Emily sends her love. Russians in Red October send their love. Ancient Greeks alone on sad islands longing send their love. Our theme is building and has vista. Time not an arrow but a recurring spiral. I see the past just ahead. The future was fine. Shots at the clocks in their towers mark the beginning of the uprising. Then we can parse the new identities, howling in the bones of an electric face. What one knows is the utter fallibility of oneself. And beauty is what continues by folding back into itself. Magnets, a lantern moon, sound, crumpled buildings climbing into trees, leaps up ladders and opens onto fields and scrubland and streams. This fact that time is a continuum which the poet and the philosopher alone practice the bending of. So a spiral starts out again from the key in the lock in the wind. Thank you. Thank you, Ian.
Thanks very much, Steve. So now we are getting close to the end of this part of the launch. Thank you, attendees, for your patience. We're going to come to you very shortly. A lot of friends and colleagues in the audience, and we're very happy to have you. We're absolutely delighted, in fact, to have you with us. So we're going to get to a discussion period, such as it is, very shortly. But our next item on the agenda, if I can put it that way, is a short video clip from another one of our contributors who couldn't be here, George Rommel, is an artist, a sculptor based at Capilano University, who actually took the photo here that was referred to, I think, was it by Kevin? He took this photo of Ian and Viviana. He is apparently having or had some technical difficulties and cannot be with us, it seems. So we will just watch this clip from him in any case. And I think Devin's going to run that. So Devin, go right ahead now, please.
Hey everybody! I got tired of waiting for the launch of this amazing book, which I've read about 4 times, or maybe more, as Bob Dylan would say. Anyway, I decided that since the whole world has gone virtual, we can always key this into a physical event someday when it happens, if it happens. So, Vienna, I was wondering if you could do the honors of pulling off the veil.
Okay.
Yay!
Oh, wow.
Now, there's 2 drawings here. One is the original, and the other is a photo of the original. And funny enough, I actually like the photo slightly more than the original because it's a little more high contrast, right?
Yeah.
But I thought Ian could decide which one he wants because, you know, the whole idea here, the idea behind my little story is that there's 2 Ians. There's the domestic Ian and there's the scholarly Ian. And I've always been fascinated at how the 2 are always overlapping and the difference between the two, and the integration between the two. So there's the scholarly Ian and the domestic Ian. So we'll see which one he picks. Okay, Ian.
Okay.
You've got to examine them up close.
Okay, I'll do that. I've seen the small reproduction,
Yeah.
but this is much more impressive. And I take it that this is the original one here. Is it?
I'm not saying anything yet.
Okay. Well, I only am saying that because you said this one came out with more contrast.
Right.
But I see what you mean. This one does have more contrast. I'm not sure if I like that though. You want me to choose right on the spot here?
Yeah, you have to choose right now.
Well, I would choose this one, I think.
Good.
Excellent.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, I was blown away when I saw this. It's
Well, I was
really-
so honored to be asked to make a contribution here because I'm the only non-writer that I think
Oh, you did
I had such a good time. I had
contribution
such a
there.
good time writing it. Okay.
Yeah, no, it was. Your piece of writing was very different than the rest of the ones in the book, and it was much more about me. So
Oh, yeah?
I felt a little bit pinned and wriggling, you know. But and this when I came across this at the end of your piece of writing was just amazing. It just blew me away.
Nicola, can you get a close shot of this? Anyway, to all the contributors of the book, I'm really looking forward to a get-together down the road. Once we get back to normacy, whatever that is. Okay.
It gives you a certain sense of the interaction between George and Ian. Lovely, you know, he's done these great prints, and George was contacting Peyman and myself. Let's get going on this launch. It's such a great book. We need to get it going, and we really were delighted by his enthusiasm. So I think now I'll turn it over to Peyman for some comments. I'll have a couple of things to say, and then we'll move to the audience. We've already had a comment in the Q&A. So, yeah.
Thanks so much, Samir. Thanks everyone for your fantastic remarks. It really adds to the celebratory spirit of this webinar or this session. Just wanted to say a few things. I'm not going to talk about my chapter. Obviously, if you look at my chapter, it's inspired by Ian's work. And also the direction in that chapter is also inspired by Ian's work and his help to direct me into the phenomenological world. That was a completely new discovery for me. So for which I'm eternally thankful. But just wanted to talk about a couple of things, and you've mentioned basically what I mean to say in various ways. You have already said, like Glenn Fidley said, about the beauty of this book. And if you look at the book, the artwork and the execution, the font, everything in this book is beautiful. It really is a beautiful object, to have, to possess and hold in your hand. It's just, unlike most of the books in the market. So I'm just advertising for this also, but from the point of view of marketing, but it really is a very beautiful object. It just, fantastically and professionally executed. So, with that remark, it's just, I want to talk about the way the contributions in this book, in their irreducible diversity, really speak to the legacy of Ian Angus's thinking, in the sense that just like the title of the book, Crossing Borders, none of these contributions really sticks, or belongs, I should say, in one discipline. They all try to go beyond, and explore what is beyond. And that is really about Ian's Angus. And it's it also reports the dialogues that we all have had with Ian, dialogues that most of which are actually unspoken. So in a way that we have been reading Ian, I've read, I don't know, probably all of Ian's work, maybe one, except one or two, I don't know. Maybe I don't know that, And this really is about that legacy that I'm talking about. With that, I want to point out Ian's newest book, Groundwork of Phenomenological Marxism, that, in my conversations with Ian, he never really talked about it, but he really hinted at it all the time, that he's really working on this or working towards this. And finally, this project is here. It seems to me, I haven't read it, but it seems to me like a compelling contribution to that fantastic turn that a lot of phenomenologists and a lot of Marxists have been, waiting for, for a sort of foundational work that would bring the two schools of thought together. Once again, a form of crossing of borders. So, just like Jerry Zazov mentioned, just like Len Fidley mentioned, this is a book that embodies friendships, and with that friendship, there is community that is being born, and that community is really the condition of possibility of thinking together. Each in our own ways, but thinking together actually in response to one another. But it's also the outcome of this. The book is also the outcome of this community. So in that, Ian Angus has created a community, maybe unwittingly, maybe without knowing this, but he has indeed created an intellectual community, far-reaching, and for that I'm very grateful. And I wish you all the best, Ian. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peyman. I would also like to echo what Len said about the beauty of this book. And Peyman, those are wonderful words from you. I think that I'd also really like to just read out something that we had put into the acknowledgements, specifically related to the production of this book. And that is many thanks to Todd Besant, Irene Bindi, and Patricia Sanders at ARP Books for the professionalism and attention to detail through an really an expedited publication process. It was a real pleasure working with the press. Again, I'm so thankful to Ian Wallace for the artwork for the cover, and it was a real pleasure working with each and every one of you and those who were not able to make it in the editorial process. It was really engaging. I think we had some nice exchanges, especially with Len Finley, which were very enjoyable and also quite instructive. So I think that in a way capped off very nicely what Peyman has been saying about intellectual friendships. And I suppose I could go into some detail about my relationship with Ian, how I came to know him through his work before I even came to SFU, before I even met him in person. I remember reading A Border Within and being just quite knocked off my feet by the fact that somebody working in this field of Canadian studies could actually quote Max Horkheimer. I thought this was quite extraordinary. And I think that that also had quite an influence on me in terms of just this steadfast commitment to interdisciplinarity. And also, again, I don't think this title is in any way metaphorical. It's very real. Crossing borders, moving between disciplines, between subjects, between registers of discourse, between the academy and the public sphere, the realm of private life, and I think above all, really of friendship. I'll come back to that just in a second, but I think also as as a slightly younger academic, and certainly was much younger when I arrived at SFU and first met with Ian. And I think the whole interview process was so fascinating and beguiling and enigmatic. Ian came, knocked on the office that I was preparing in, and said to me, as I was trying to get my thoughts, which were very scattered, together in order to, perform as well as I possibly could in the interview process, Ian just comes and introduces himself, and he says, pay no mind to what I'm going to say in a few minutes over there, okay? And then he walks off. He's in the room, and I'm thinking, well, whatever does that mean? So I'm now doubly or triply confused. I did manage to figure it out. I could see the sort of politics that were unfolding before me on the committee. But it was such a gesture of solidarity. It's something I'll never forget. It was such a moment, really, of us becoming friends in that particular instance. And I think it's just developed from that point on. I could talk about endless conversations that we've had across a whole range of topics. I could talk about the kind of work that we've done that Steve Collis was alluding to at the Institute for the Humanities. Now, there's a long and tangled story there about Ian's own, relationship with the Institute before I kind of even arrived properly on the scene as director, which I don't want to get into. Not a particularly happy memory to raise at this point. I think in all of these different episodes, let's say, through which I've gotten to know Ian and really, I think, become a good friend of his, is that he in these many different realms of life, or our life that we share in many ways. He's been a real role model. He's been a role model as a teacher, a mentor, a thinker, a philosopher, a public intellectual. And there aren't many. There are not many role models in one's life. And he has been a really crucial one, really crucial in terms of setting a certain kind of standard of rigor, of openness, of understanding. And I think what it really comes down to when we think of all of those things, what is the core to it? I think the core to this is decency. Ian, at his core, is a decent human being. And this decency manifests itself in virtually everything that Ian does. So the last thing I would say is something kind of banal, but I think it's quite telling in terms of how I feel about Ian. A couple of weeks ago, we had decided that we were going to meet. We had some things to chat. We talk about. We also just wanted to chat and catch up. So he drove to my place, and I met him outside. We physically distanced and proceeded to walk up Mount Pleasant. And in the course of that, about an hour and 15 minutes together, we traversed our private lives, what was going on with our health, how we were doing in terms of our work, the political conditions of the day, and just in a sense touching base about things that were of mutual concern. We walked up to Mount Pleasant and we walked back home, and that was, in a sense, in a nutshell, the kind of multifaceted nature of our friendship and our relationship. And so it's a real pleasure and privilege to celebrate your work, Ian. I think probably the best account of our intellectual engagement, and I think this was really one of the highlights of putting this book together, was a discussion that you, Peyman, and myself had in public, whatever it was, 2 years ago. That was a really enjoyable set of exchanges that we had. So that's what I have to say. Now I'll turn it over to you, Ian, and then we can hear from the audience.
Okay, well, as you can probably imagine, it's extremely disconcerting to have a lot of people talk about you, especially when they're all facing you. And when they say nice things about you, I can't help but wonder when the boom is going to be lowered. But I'm extremely grateful to all of you, to Peyman and to Samir for editing the book, and for all of the rest of you for participating in it. It's true that I think thinking, there's a moment of absolute solitariness in thinking, but on both sides of that moment of solitariness, there's friendship, and friendship allows one to live through that solitariness and to reach out from it to other people. So all of you have played a role in my life, in my actual life, in my intellectual life. I've learned from all of you in different times. I think I've heard every one of you speak, and I've been to Ian's exposure at the art gallery in Vancouver a couple of years ago and spent a lot of time looking at those. And I learned, anyway, I thought I'd better not speak about people individually, because if I do that, this will go on a very long time. So I'm just extremely grateful. And the one thing that I will say, because it has struck me, is that in the course of that interview 2 years ago, Peyman referred to me being a kind of an exile. And luckily, I knew that because it was coming from him, it was based on some kind of understanding. But I was surprised that it could be perceived by him. And then Jerry is speaking about exile. It's come up a lot, the outsider, the exile. You're right. You're absolutely right. That's a key part of who I am. Why exactly is awfully hard to say. But it's something I quite consciously tried to keep secret for a long time. So I guess you turn out to be the group of people I couldn't keep it secret from.
Thank you very much, Ian. So now I really would like to encourage audience members. This is a very unfortunate format for this kind of personal laudation of Ian. It's a shame we can't just invite everybody up here, as it were, and to be able to unmute their video feed and their audio feed and actually make interventions and say a few words and ask questions. So unfortunately, we don't have that option, to my knowledge. So we'll have Q&As. I'll read them out. We already have Bob Hackett who's put something in there. I'll read it out just for the benefit of the recording. But Ian, you can obviously see it. And I would encourage others to do the same if you would like. So here's a colleague of ours at SFU from communications who's now also retired, Bob Hackett. Congratulations, Ian, on this well-deserved celebration, and thanks to all the contributors. If you feel inclined, here are a couple of questions. Your work is so wide-ranging that these may fall outside the scope of today's discussion, but if you're inclined, here they are. So number one, 20 years after your monograph on social movements and democracy, would you still regard movements as agents capable of revitalizing public spheres? Two, in the past 20 years, the resurgence of the Indigenous has taught settler scholars that Canada can't be construed as an innocent political entity subject to historic domination vis-a-vis the US. Can you see political and ideological project? Can you see a political / ideological project that both recognizes the complicity of Canadian nationalism with racist colonialism and yet harnesses the energy of populism in building social movements vis-a-vis the interacting existential crises facing organized human society? That sounds suspiciously like the question you asked at the discussion, Bob. But those are great questions. Ian, over to you. We have a couple of others.
Yeah, well, it's, I guess, a good thing to be asked questions that you really wish you knew the answer to. But one of the things that came through to me more clearly from reading what people said in the book than it had previously was that there is a whole period, a set of interventions I made around and through Canadian studies, specifically, really, that had to do with a certain historical period, which even when I was writing them, that was disappearing, and I think perhaps has disappeared now, a moment at which there was a certain independence in Canada and a certain sense of aggrievedness with regards to the USA, which could perhaps, one thought, be turned into a decolonizing project that would go far beyond what we would now call the settler population and would address the more deep-seated regional antagonisms of the country and how they've been set in place by the adventures of the British Empire. Now that seems now like that is gone, I think, as a project, and it's precisely because neoliberalism has, the neoliberal project began with the free trade agreement, NAFTA, and began in Canada, and that's kind of interestingly important, right? So I think to some extent this notion that there was a space in which one could perhaps achieve things, I don't think so anymore. So to some extent, I think that is why I've more or less returned to questions based in Marxism and other forms of criticism of empire that are not specifically Canadian at all. Though of course, there's always a bit of a local tinge to everything, but they're basically world problems. And so about social movements, I do think that the social movements occurred in that period in which large-scale social change of the basic socioeconomic system was kind of off the agenda. And so what was on the agenda instead was kind of, it's a little unfair to call them just ameliorative movements, but they were movements aimed at addressing specific problems and not the general source of basic structural inequality. So I don't think anymore that the movements are positive unless they are tied into that movement for overall general social transformation. In fact, as Samir has shown quite trenchantly in a few recent essays, the whole idea of the movements can become a claim to own a certain identity, which then becomes quite reactionary in expelling other people from it, so that we get just, competing identities. And again, it's this within a zero-sum game. That's the problem now. To some extent, it's sobering to think, but this is the judgment of time, right? A large part of my work was tied to a period which does seem to have passed. Now, what do I see emerging from this? Well, very much in sympathy with Len's criticism of my use of the term English Canada in the book. I think that I'm not sure he was always right, but I think he's right now. That the issue of the Indigenous people is very much on the agenda, not just as not so much as a specific issue, but as what ties, which becomes a systemic criticism that goes back into the whole formation of the world we live in by the period of empires. And it's the British, of course, very important for us, but it's not just the British, it's also the French and the Dutch and, all the rest of it. So that's a big thing to try and take apart, right? But I think that it is being taken apart. The whole people are raising a question of what can be done to respond to the great historical theft, apart from everything else, just cruelty, but theft that that slavery represents. I mean, I don't know what can address something of that kind of historical scope and so on, but the interesting thing is that it is in some way on the agenda, as other things of that similar scope are. So what do I see now? I see some long-term historical structures deconstructing themselves. We're in the middle of that process of ongoing historical deconstruction. And it's producing, it's not all good and it's not all going to be good, but it is important. And I think to the extent that that any local struggle can be tied into that, yeah, I think it remains important. I invite others to comment on this.
Sure, we can do that, although there are also some other comments that I can read. So if people would like to reflect on that, and we can come back to Bob's questions, but there are some other things that I'd like to just read out. And one, appropriately enough, is not a question, but a comment from Larry Green. Besides Ian's rigorous intelligence, which has been mentioned frequently, I found his style to be most engaging. He seems to love life. He exceeds his professional identity. So that's a comment from Larry Green. I don't know if people want to weigh in on that, the question or questions posed by Bob, but here's another question from Frank Cunningham. What next? I can't see you in a pasture.
Yes. Unfortunately, I don't seem to be able to stop thinking. If I try to, I start to become, as Viviana will no doubt attest, I start to become a huge pain in the ass. So the only thing I can do is keep my mind somehow occupied. And Sudokus won't fill it all. So yeah, I've just finished this book called Groundwork of Phenomenological Marxism, which is something I did want to write, kind of the book that I thought, the philosophy that I had always sort of thought of as behind what I was writing, you know. But that's finished now. So I've been working on a couple of short essays and I'm scouting around.
I should also announce the fact that we will be launching the book. We'll be launching your book on phenomenological Marxism in the coming months. So people should keep their eyes peeled for that. So it's very exciting. And Andrew Feenberg, congratulations on this new book. And Andrew will be part of the discussion around the book at the launch. So thanks for that, Andrew. Any more comments from the audience? Oh yes, Sven Robinson. Yes, thank you for the reminder, Peyman. Honored to join the celebration of Ian Angus. So many remarkable contributions, but I want to thank Ian for his incredible integrity and courage in speaking out in defense of David Noble back in 2001. I don't think we need to get into this, but an act that was not without its own consequences. And so indeed, this is moral courage. And this is, I think, what I was also thinking about in terms of Ian being a real role model in this respect. Yeah, I don't know if there are any other thoughts on the questions that Bob Hackett raised.
Well, let me just say one more sentence then.
Yeah.
This book on phenomenological Marxism suggests, in a way that relies more on an interpretation of Marx than on Heidegger, even though he uses the term planetary technology, that the current configuration of the crisis is the opposition between planetary technology on the one hand and place-based indigeneity on the other hand. And that this is a crisis that is encompassing the entire planet. And it is about not a crisis really well, it is between two different populations, as these things always play out that way. But it's also a crisis in for those of us who are not indigenous people, who have been de-indigenized. We all did begin as place-based human beings. And in fact, in many ways, we reinvent that and retain it. So this crisis between a kind of formal universal and a particular place location, which is something that has been in my thought for a long time, is something which I'm still trying to give a contemporary formulation to in a way that would perhaps clarify things a bit.
Well, I actually have a question that comes out of that, Ian, and that would be, how does that frame help us to think about the future of the university? This is something in a way that's come back to us, hasn't it? There about maybe 5 to 7 years ago, maybe a decade ago, there was talk about these MOOCs, these sort of massive online courses, and you'd have, just a few select elite institutions that would be offering them, and then all the other universities would really be in a tremendous kind of crisis. And this seems to have come back in a way in the pandemic with Zoom, and the way in which Zoom and other platforms such as this make possible, the spread and deepening of exactly that planetary technology, which seems to then efface the local in particular. So I wonder, you have written a very important book on the university. I wonder if you had any thoughts about that and how universities might position themselves.
Well, in many ways, I think Len can answer this question better than me. He's thought about this a great deal and incorporated it into his speaking practice. That kind of digital tendency, let's call it, is going to go on. There's no doubt that it will go on, and it will be accelerated, and the university will continue to be transformed into a money-making institution in the way that, everything, including water and air, are being transformed into commodities in the world that we are already starting to inhabit and will inhabit even more in the future. So what can we do? Well, I do think that there are places where the university does make kind of localizing moves, which are not simply subsumable under that kind of broad tendency. So, I do see Len's unit on the Indigenous Humanities in Saskatchewan as an important place where that's going for the humanities. We're trying to deal, we deal much more here with Vancouver, British Columbia, and the world than we do with Canada at all. And I think, that's for good reasons. So I do think things like that can be done, and we have to look for them. I don't know if there's a general strategy for it, though. We look always to try to take into account where you actually are, and the acknowledgements of the Indigenous people who've occupied the land before us and still occupy it with us. These are important, that there's always the danger they'll become mere formalities, right? But there's also the possibility for grounding the speech in something much more real. So, I would just start to mention lots of different things. I don't have a general solution to this problem, but I do think there are things that can be done. There's always something that can be done. It's never entirely hopeless.
I'm wondering, Len, if you wanted to say a few words. Ian did in a sense pass the torch over. If you want to say a few things.
Well, I think that I would organize the possibilities of resistance and preservation of what needs to be preserved, and the reinvention of the parts of the Euro-Canadian University project that need to be rethought. And one of the areas is perhaps internal to particular institutions, in that the notion of indigenizing and decolonizing one's institutions, that has to be rooted in locality, and it has to be deeply attentive to the detail, the specificities, and the protective ceremonies around the, all Canadian universities are on Indigenous land. We've got to the rhetorical recognition, formulaic though it be, insincere, no doubt, as it is coming from some people. But I see that the indigenizing and decolonizing, 20 years ago, if you looked at in the age of the mission statement for Canadian universities, mission statements everywhere, the fact that leapt out was the more prestigious the university, the less likely to find the word Indigenous in any of its mission statements. That is, it was an ultra-colonial, white elitist discourse. That has gone. It's created room. It's created panic in some quarters. People are reluctant to relinquish their privileges. But the indigenizing / decolonizing that is now part of the self-representation of innumerable institutions across the country. That is a site of emergent possibilities and considerable urgency. I think beyond that, there is the public-private locus of imperilment, but also of possibility and resistance. And this is the gathering of corporate technology to plunder the public system. That is to say that the shift online of so much teaching, the managerial unilateralism in extremis, that we're having to do this, has resulted in a number of things. One of these is that the complaints from faculty across the country to CAUT on academic considerations have ballooned. And the ground of the grievance is the scene of instruction. That is, there has been a huge explosion of people's experience of their own variable vulnerability under the aegis of teaching. Will they all become, is this the moment of Uberization of the academy with little pockets of STEM privilege here and there? Or do we hold on to it in its diversity and in a reasonably equitable distribution of resources? And what's happening there is that this global technology sees health and education as two places of immense self-enrichment. And out of the, and so they're positioning themselves as technological facilitators of the core functions of universities, but they're doing it in a way that is becoming explicitly more predatory and benefiting from the major mistake of academic leadership in Canada, which is to mistake secrecy for the need for confidentiality. And that particular difference, I think. So what's happening? Canadian Federation of Students, new coalitions are emerging. CAUT, Canadian Federation of Students, the Royal Society. I've just been in a working group with the Royal Society on post-secondary education post-COVID. And we have been trying, just published a report. We have been trying to do that. The Royal Society, which was kindly described as a range of extinct volcanoes, has actually come back to life and is using this. In fact, I was just on a Zoom with the Austrian Academy of Sciences on the question of the credibility of science, the question of the militant populism the mobilization, not knowledge mobilization, but ignorance mobilization in order to undermine, to feed vaccine nationalism, vaccine denialism, and so on. So that Canada, there's a number of international developments coming out at quite high levels, I think, that share the common sense of peril. And so there are a number of things, but it's getting these together, getting these people talking to one another, getting them to build some levels of trust so that a major pushback can come, which will have to, in part, I think, and appropriately, locate the academic intellectual predicament inside the student body rather than outside it. And that's one of the things that's happening. So I can go on and on, but there's lots of things happening. And academic freedom is being revisited and revitalized as the ground of excellence, as well as the ground of accountability to the public interest and the people and the students that we serve. So there are interesting things coming.
Thank you, Len. We do have one more, actually a question. I think we'll take this question and it'll be time to bring the proceedings to a close. So here we go. I want to thank everyone for all of your excellent presentations. Ian, do you think in the United States, if the current administration does reduce student debt, that will reverse the trend towards universities depending on profits, or will it simply force universities to look for other sources of income? In the United States, the way the system is set up currently, many smaller universities can only survive on large tuition payments.
Yeah, well, I do think it's encouraging that the question of student debt has become a part of a public political discussion. And I do think that it is extremely important from the viewpoint of, since we live in a highly scientific technological society, it is very difficult to make a decent living without some form of advanced education / training, which means that these 4 or 5 years after high school, and maybe more, become a time in which many people are put into debt. And in many places, it's much worse in the United States than it is here, but it is a problem here too. A debt that it takes them years to get out of, if they can ever get out of. So the question of student debt is essentially a part of the proletarianization of the middle class, to put it in a phrase. So what will we see with this? Well, what I hope we will see anyway is that there are some significantly progressive elements in the Democratic Party in the United States, and I hope that they will see this as part of a general strategy back on the shifting of wealth to the wealthy away from the, it seems strange, but there are so many poor that you can in fact shift the wealth from the poor to the wealthy. So this is what's going on elsewhere. Whether one particular policy will do this or that really depends more than anything else on the context within which that policy is either won or lost. If it's seen as part of a general strategy to address wealth distribution in the society, I think it has a good chance of making a case to people who are not in universities and see themselves as not ever being there, or their children not being there. And I think also it can, the other thing that's important with this, and it's been very important for my generation in Canada, and indeed many other countries, is that when there is significant public investment in education to the point of keeping tuition low, supporting students with loans that aren't crippling, that can be paid off in a few years, forgiving loans for various kinds of social service, which has been tried out in certain places. Once you get an education in a system like that, excuse me, every thinking person feels a debt of gratitude. And so what they want to do is pass that on to younger people, to the next generation, pardon me. And our problem now is that sense of debt to the previous generation that you will pay off to the next generation has been cut with this, again, neoliberal individualistic ideology that I study, I pay, therefore everything I get back is for me. And to some extent, so long as you make people pay crippling things, to some extent, it's legitimate that it goes back to them. So you've got a self-reinforcing circle there. And the only way out of it is, yes, as the questioner put forward, to propose some kind of social programs which make it easier to study, which therefore make it easier to see intelligence and education as part of the social situation, not an individual thing. And Lenore could tell us about the cognitive developments in cognitive phenomenology and so on that tell us that the brain is not the source of intelligence, that the intelligence is spread out amongst the active capacities of the human body and beyond the human body into indeed its social apparatus. So how to recover that kind of thing after the great working class tradition has been severed and is not being carried on? Well, it can always be rediscovered through these particular problems that people encounter, like student debt and many other things, because the problems are still there. And the source of the problems changes, yeah, but not quite so much. So, yeah, I see hope in those things. It depends how they're framed and it depends what is done. But yeah, I do.
Well, thanks, Ian. I think that's a good note on which to conclude. I just want to signal something that Ian's daughter Cassandra and his partner Viviana have said. They just thank myself and Peyman for making the celebration possible. But I think the key thing is we are sorry that it was not in person. This is certainly wonderful as well, but I would echo that. I wish we could have met in person, and of course afterwards we would go out and have a meal and raise a glass and a toast. So I'm hoping that at some point in the not too distant future we'll be able to do that and celebrate properly. So I think I'd just like to turn it over before I say a few concluding words. Peyman, any final thoughts from you?
Thank you, Samir. I think that, as I think we can all agree that this whole event and the comments and the conversations, they all attest to what Ian has contributed over the years to thinking, and with his more recent development to place-based thinking or locative thought. And I think we are all, somehow in dialogue in that. And I think this conversation will continue, especially given that you're hosting the next book launch, on Ian's new book. And I think that's actually another venue for us to, come together and continue to have conversations with Ian and his thought. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks very much, Peyman. Well, so on behalf of the Institute, I'd like to thank all of the participants, the panelists, those who are still with us and those who had to leave. Obviously, I'd like to thank the attendees. Thank you for coming and your interventions, your questions, your comments. Very much appreciated. We look forward to seeing you again in the future at some of our other events. A special thank you, though, it has to go out to Johannes Merrick, who's stuck right through. You're probably not going to even sleep tonight. You'll just have breakfast and get on with your day. Real pleasure to see you. Thank you for hanging in there from Vienna.
Thank you.
Thank you all. It's been a real pleasure. Ian, hats off to you, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all so much.
Okay.
Bravo to Ian.
Yes, I see it. Jerry, yes.
You see it?
I have that too. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.